is 16. She has Angelman Syndrome, and the other two are 21 and 18, both in college. So welcome, good morning. I'm here to introduce the speakers for today. A few housekeeping notes. One is, don't forget the cell phone etiquette, right? I want to make sure those are muted. I'm definitely guilty of that a lot. And then we have two just break-wise for today. There'll be, two breaks, one at 10:30 and then one at 4. After today's speakers, they're going to be broken up into different areas of the building. So you'll have breaks at that point in time. And then you'll have 12 to 12:15 as a break as well for lunch. And don't forget to remember to use your Bonafide app. I'm supposed to say that as well. With that, I'll introduce the speakers for today. Bonfire. There's so many out. So the clinicians are going to come up one at a time, I think, for today, but I'll just go ahead and make introductions for all of them. They can introduce themselves as well when they come up. So Dr. Jessica Duis is here from Vanderbilt AS Clinic. Mark Nespeca from San Diego Clinic, and Ron Thibert from Mass General. So please give a warm welcome for these guys this morning.
So before I get started, I've been asked to announce that there's a study going on at the conference to look at a possible objective outcome measure for clinical trials called event-related potential, where they put a cap on just like they would do an EEG and ask your child to listen to some words. So they're out there at one of the tables if you're interested in that. So I'm going to talk about Angelman Syndrome from infancy through early toddlerhood, and then the next speaker will come up and cover the next age range. So one really important point is that individuals with Angelman are not recognized during pregnancy. So pregnancies are typically normal. And then during infancy, it can be quite variable. A lot of times kids are not picked up until they have developmental delay around 6 to 12 months of age. Low muscle tone is very common in problems with feeding. I think a lot of times we think of that more with some of the other chromosome 15 disorders, but that we definitely see that commonly in Angelman syndrome as well. And then reflux disease is something that we see often in babies, vomiting after feeding, spitting up, and that can also contribute to something called failure to thrive, where kids are having trouble growing. One thing that we've begun to recognize more and more and is of interest is something called cortical visual impairment. So babies with Angelman syndrome oftentimes will see that they have difficulty tracking, and even visual threat or lights they don't respond to well, and we think that this is something called cortical visual impairment or something like it, where they're not having the appropriate input. When we look at the structure of the eye is normal, and the brain MRI as well, that does not appear that there's any problems with the way that the eye looks. But we do see that there's some issues with response to visual threat or tracking. And then tremors and myoclonus can also be present very early. So especially when kids are falling asleep or waking up, you might see some twitches of the hand or the foot. So this is characteristic features of Angelman syndrome, and I think one of the things that we've begun to recognize as well is early social emergence. So very interested in interaction, and even very early laughter. Parents will recall retrospectively around the time of diagnosis that their child was always very social and had laughter. And then the characteristic EEG features are present this early on. So we see this, what we call a notched delta. So you see these waves here. That's a good example where there's this kind of like spike and wave, and the neurologists will be better able to describe this for you, but we do see that very early on. And seizures do on average start around age 2. and can be the worst during this time period. Other features that are important, so strabismus with crossing of an eye, they can have signs that they have development of flattening of the back of the head. Characteristically, a lot of kids with Angelman, even if they don't have deletion, may have some hypopigmentation. Again, the characteristic laughter can be present very early on, even before 4 months. And then this failure to thrive, so this is a growth chart of one of our patients with Angelman, and you can see that start out on the curve at birth and then sort of start to fall off the curve for both weight and for height. And then the other thing we've recognized in infants is an inability to temperature regulate, particularly a heat intolerance. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So there's been a lot of discussion about something called microcephaly, which is one of the characteristic features that was originally described with Angelman syndrome. And originally it was described to be present in about 80% of individuals. It's not present at birth, but if it's going to be present, we usually see it by the age of 2. So early on, there is a significant proportion of individuals with Angelman syndrome who do have difficulty feeding. And in particular, that can be related to the low muscle tone that we see. And so one of the things that we can see is aspiration. So I'm going to play this video to show you what aspiration looks like. Sorry. And you can see that this is a swallow study, and you can see that a little bit goes down the wrong way. And so we do see that in Angelman syndrome. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to make changes to feeding. Sometimes it's not. I think it's present in a lot of kids, but it's not clinically significant in the fact that they don't ever get pneumonias or have problems from it. But it's something to keep an eye on and work with a feeding therapist to monitor for. And then reflux is also very prevalent at this age and can contribute, as I said, to failure to thrive. And then there is a subgroup of kids who actually also have that poor interest in feeding that's typically described with other chromosome 15 disorders. So this is data from the natural history study. I wanted to update the data that's available from the literature to show you what we're seeing in terms of achievement of milestones during this age range. So this is sitting, and so the average age for sitting here was about 10 months, 10 to 12 months. This is walking independently, so the average age of walking independently was about age 3. And then developmental milestones in terms of fine motor skills, so pincer grasp. This is also around 30 months, so 2.5 or so. So motor concerns are also very significant, both in terms of causing developmental delay and delays in walking, but also communication concerns. So apraxia, we think that a lot of the communication difficulties is not because they don't have the words in there, but because they have difficulties with motor planning. Tremor is also very common in this age range, and then again, the unbalanced walking or difficulty with balancing and coordination is called ataxia. So communication as well. So I'm focusing on this younger age range. So in this age range, kids are emergent communicators, and then later they become context-dependent communicators. And so this is where it's very important for intervention and talking to your child. And so if you look at the data from the literature, what you see is that kids with Angelman actually have pretty good receptive language, and it's really a deficit in their ability to express themselves, so their expressive language. And that's where that apraxia comes in. Other concerns, there's going to be some talk specifically on sleep, but of course sleep can be a very big problem in this young age range. And they have been shown to have abnormal sleep-wake cycles. And then GI concerns are a big concern in this age range. So constipation, which is sometimes separate from food allergies and very common overall, but sometimes can be caused by food allergies as well. So something to keep in mind is different foods that you're trying during this age range, and it's good to introduce foods very slowly. So, over a week, introduce each new food so that you can monitor for things that are signs of food allergies, like development of rash or changes in bowel habits. And of course, reflux. We are seeing that anxiety is probably an issue this young in Angelman syndrome. And so there was a paper that came out not too long ago from the group at UNC that showed that in particular, it's separation anxiety, and it can manifest at some of the behavioral things, so hair pulling, pinching. What we've seen in clinic is a lot of times parents describe kids shutting down, so they'll bring them into a new environment like a conference like this, and the kids will shut down or significantly change their behavior to what parents are noticing in their normal environment. It can also be related to other problems like sleep difficulties, so kids who sleep more poorly can have more signs of anxiety. And also anxiety can be associated with some of the emergence of those aggressive behaviors. So there's lots of other behavioral impacts that we see at this age: hyperactivity, impulsivity, very distractible, and we can also see something called stereotypies, so hand flapping or rocking. And certainly we see some autistic features as well, impaired adaptive behavior, and then excessive chewing and mouthing behaviors have been reported. So I just want to emphasize that some of this is corresponds to what type of Angelman your child has. And so in particular, deletion seems from a developmental perspective to be more significant in terms of developmental delays than UBE3A mutation.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm tasked with the tweens from age 5 to 12. And let me see if I can figure out how to advance this. Is it the red button, Marlon? Green. Higher? Oh, that one. Great. Okay. So, in doing this, I wanted to look back and see what the first North American description of a set of cases of Angelman syndrome were, and that was from Dr. Williams, who I don't see in the audience, but may have been at the reception last night. He's sort of one of the two North American fathers or grandfathers of clinical genetics in Angelman syndrome, both he and Dr. Wagstaff. So he described in 1982, which was way before cell phones and connected computers and so forth, 6 cases of Angelman syndrome. 5 of them were in adults. Only 1 of them was in this tween age group. And the features that he described at that age were episodes of laughter and tongue protrusion, quote, petit mal seizures since the age of 1.5, which had been difficult to control. And back then, we only had 4 drugs in the United States to try to control that. Things are really different now. The child began walking at age 6, said mama at age 9, and then never developed any other words. And had what was described as a robot-like gait with marked ataxia, a lack of arm coordination, flat rear part of the head, and a prominent jaw called mandibular prognathism. This person also had a lightly pigmented iris, and both feet were externally rotated. And these are features that you can commonly see in that earlier age group that Jessica was talking about. But the main features that this person developed that I think tends to emerge later on is the mild thoracic scoliosis and lumbar lordosis. And it was interesting to me that this individual had normal muscle tone and normal stretch reflexes, where it's very, very commonly in that earlier age group, muscle tone is reduced, and then later on it becomes increased in the distal part of the legs. A lot of these features are features that are present before age 5 and continue throughout age 5 to 12. And one is the typical happy smiling demeanor. If you have microcephaly, it tends to stay with you. Light hair and skin color for deletion positive patients. Wide mouth, wide spaced teeth, drooling, mouthing behaviors, strabismus, unless it's corrected by a ophthalmological procedure. Sometimes it's corrected so well that you never know the child ever had strabismus. Uplifted arms when walking, sensitivity to heat, brisk muscle stretch reflexes at the knees and ankles, and hyperkinetic behavior, jerky movement quality, abnormal sleep cycles, and an attraction to water and crinkly things. How many of you have kids who loved Christmas time when there were lots of wrapping paper to crinkle? Okay. So what features are most prominent in this age group that I'm tasked with describing? So I tried to look at data short of accessing Megan's global registry data. I just didn't have the time or wherewithal to get into that, but I'm sure the data is in there that if I had a day or two to mine it, I could come up with it. So there's a nice book that Bernard Dan wrote several years ago where he describes many, many aspects of Angelman syndrome in a book that's about this thick, much of which was from his experience, and he's a child neurologist in Belgium. The experience I have is largely from the natural history study and from various trials that we did in San Diego, and I was doing the neuro exams for a lot of those kids. And also, prior to our Angelman clinic, we would see a lot of kids with Angelmans, regardless of whether they were in a study or not, through our regular neurology clinic. And also input from parents. I asked numerous parents before I came if they can tell me what they feel were most salient features of living with their child in this age group is currently compared to earlier age or was back then, and these are parents of older kids. So with the natural history study, when we enrolled patients, this gives you an idea of how old they were when they were enrolled. And many of the patients we followed from their common enrollment time of 2, 3, 4 years old up for about 6 years before the initial phase of the natural history study funding ended and then picked up a few years later. So many of these kids I would get to see once a year to do their neuro exams, which was shorter than what Dr. Bird did, and do an extensive questioning of them. Also, I talked to a person that's been involved with some of the preliminary data collection about parental concerns at different age groups. And these were the things that came out as the primary concerns. And I'm sure this is no surprise to you, that if there was something they wanted to be treated in their child, it would be communication, sleep, and seizures. And I don't think that's unique to this particular age group. When we look at the 5 to 12 age group and think about their growth, on average, the height of individuals with Angelman syndrome is a little bit lower than average, but it's usually still within the normal range. Your head size, as that continues to grow over time, tends to pick a curve that it's going to stay on once you are age 3, 4, or 5 and stay with that through the rest of your life. And in weight, what we see is this is a common time at which kids start to add on weight. And obesity can be an issue, and I think in the study that was recently reported in the Netherlands, it was, I think, 20% or so qualified for being obese. And this is the age group that we tend to see that in many kids. In a minority of kids in this age group, you can see skeletal features of scoliosis that'll need to be tracked continually as they get into teenage and adult age ranges. And I think that often the pronation of the feet can be a little bit more prominent, perhaps because they have more weight to put on them and they seem more flat at that age. But it's evident earlier, but even more evident in this age group in my experience. GI issues, as Jessica mentioned, are often present beforehand, but I think in terms of hearing complaints and concerns about that, this is the age where I tend to sort of hear more people saying constipation is more of an issue. It tends to be related to having more limited mobility and a child having a preference for white food, which many of you may be familiar with. Not in only your Angelman kids, but also your typical kids who don't like lovely green vegetables like kale. Many times the early life dysphagia and feeding problems can improve over time as they get older. That's not always the case, but it's true for many. And reflux can be present at this age also, and it can be, in my view, it can often be very difficult to diagnose. And as Ron mentioned yesterday, it can manifest itself as a wide variety of different issues with behavior problems, increased seizures, and so forth. And so I often have a low threshold of referring patients to see our gastroenterologist, particularly to make sure they don't have a special treatable condition called eosinophilic esophagitis. And because I've had a couple of kids with Angelman's and other neurodevelopmental disabilities who have had that, got it treated, and things settled down considerably for them. Another statistic that I found, that's not necessarily from my experience, is that up to 30% of kids can achieve toilet training, and this is often the time frame in which that will occur for those who achieve that. It's no surprise of you in the audience who have kids this age or had kids in this age group that a high proportion of them continue to have problems getting to sleep or staying asleep through the night. And the other thing from my experience is that sometimes this will fluctuate. Parents will tell me, oh, Johnny's been sleeping great for the last year and a half, and then bingo, something occurs in their life where sleep goes to hell in a handbasket again, and it's really hard to get under control. There was also a recent report from our colleagues at the AS clinic at Mayo Clinic, where they looked at sleep studies and found if you had what's called periodic leg movements in sleep, a substantial proportion of those kids had an iron deficiency as measured by a blood ferritin level, and we're hopeful that treating that could improve sleep, and they reported that in some cases that did. So if you have a child with sleep problems who moves around a lot, you can talk to your pediatrician or neurologist and ask them just to check to make sure your child's not iron deficient. The problem with that is if your child is iron deficient, then treating iron deficiency can result in constipation. So it's a tough situation no matter how you cut it. Communication and cognition is a challenge in this age group, but I think one of the things that often happens is that there we might see a couple of words emerge in some kids. I believe in this age group that parents, other caregivers, and perceptive, concerned teachers and communication therapists have a better understanding of what a child's gestures mean. Many times this is occurring before you hit age 5, but in this age group, commonly parents feel more adept at really understanding what their kids want. And this is an age group where it's really apparent to me from stories parents tell me of how smart many kids are. I mean, there are things that parents tell me their kids can do with electronic devices, even though they might have some fine motor impairment, that far exceeds what I can do on an electronic device. That may have something to do with my age, but who knows. And I think that one of the things that tends to sort itself out is this is an age where you sort of get an idea of what's going to be working best for your child, whether it's going to be focusing more on AAC communication or enhanced natural gestures, and I think a lot of people realize that their kids use a combination of those two things to communicate. In terms of typical neurological issues in this age group, a big issue surrounds seizures and an EEG. When I first started, there was kind of a sort of standard notion that as kids with Angelman syndrome got older, their seizures got better. And then when Ron Thibert put out the questionnaire several years ago, that was we tried to get an idea of what meds people were using and so forth. I think that shattered my notion that once you hit age 5, 6, or 7 and your seizures are gone, then you're home free. Because we found that there are many individuals that continue to have seizures in adolescence and adulthood who may have had a period of time of relative remission in seizures. And I think that one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that over the years, I think many people that have gravitated toward Ron's clinic in Boston were people that tended to have more problems with seizures, appropriately, because he and his team have great expertise in dealing with that. Whereas a lot of the kids that I would see were in the natural history study database, and a high proportion of them had relatively easily controlled seizures, just using 1 or 2 medications, and that wasn't a huge issue for many of them. So I think my experience was with a relatively milder group, although we do have many kids who have had tough to control seizures. One of the things that I think supported this original notion was a study that was reported in 2005 from Japan, where in 23 patients, 80% of deletion positive patients were seizure-free from, quote, childhood up until the age of 30. And that's the thing that I think most of you hope for, and we hope that your dreams come true as time goes on. There have been reports in literature that the EEG will often improve over time, but there's really not great data about that until recently reported data that looked at consolidated data from the natural history study EEGs that were collected over different age groups. And what you can see from this is the example of what the high voltage in the Angelman group compared to the voltage of the EEG in a typically developing population is. So this is one of the things that often tips us off to a diagnosis of Angelman syndrome when a child has a seizure, developmental impairment, comes into the lab, and an astute electroencephalographer will say, oh, this child may have Angelman syndrome. If you haven't tested for that, you might want to do that. This looks over time at what happens to the voltage between age 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. And the voltage reduction occurs in this group just as it does in a typically developing group. So it tends to be, on average, not much difference, even though still it is higher overall. So there are changes in the EEG over time that can be perceived and best demonstrated with quantitative analyses like this. So one question that often comes up if you have a child who's gone many years without having a seizure is, can I go off medication or off diet therapy? And I think this is a tough issue in this group of individuals. The most common criteria that child neurologists use in deciding whether somebody can go off is if you're 2 years seizure-free and your EEG is normal at the end of that 2 years, you've got a 7 out of 10 chance of going off whatever treatment you're on and not having another seizure in the next 2 or 3 years. That EEG criteria isn't really applicable to kids with Angelman syndrome because the EEG almost never becomes really normal. But I think this is a discussion worth having. It's a challenging situation. And I think it's, when you make that decision, it's best to do it with your treating neurologist or epileptologist who's working with you. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but I think most of us would hesitate if a child has had a really, really rough go of it and had several hospitalizations for seizures. So in terms of behavior, a lot of this is from talking to parents. And one of the parents said, of a 19-year-old told me, "Oh yeah, I remember what happened back in those age. He went into the bathroom, and when we went in to check on him after 2 minutes, he'd squeezed all the shampoo and all of the toothpaste all over the place, and it just took 2 minutes for him to do that. When we got there, he seemed very proud and happy of what he had done." So he is looking at a career as an interior decorator. So oftentimes hyperactivity and irritability will increase during this age group compared to earlier age group. The questions I have is whether this is more problematic because the kids are bigger and they're stronger. I think certainly if you think back at how problematic it was for you when your 2-year-old pulled your hair as opposed to your 12-year-old who's as big as you are pulling your hair and can really drag you down, it becomes more and more of an issue. I think in many circumstances, these behaviors seem to be a desire for social contact, and Dr. Oliver in the United Kingdom had really speculated and shown some evidence that that was the case years ago. Is a big issue that they can't really communicate their desires as well as they would like to, and I think that probably plays a big role in that. Or is it simply an expression of overall anxiety? I think these are questions that we don't have really definitive answers to, and we try to work with the best we can in analyzing the situation. And these are items that parents reported to me that some of you will hit home with some of you and not with others. So one parent told me that a big issue that came in this age group was gagging, just repeated gagging that would come out of the blue. She saw gastroenterology, had swallow studies, endoscopy, and so forth. People thought, oh, it's probably reflux. Tried on 3 different reflux medications. None of it worked at all. And then as time went on, over a couple of years, they realized it was a behavioral thing that seemed to be more of an attention-getting device for the child. And once they implemented a behavioral program, the gagging dissipated and never returned. Some parents have told me constipation worsens in that age. Others have told me constipation improves. Some have told me that they've developed some compulsive and repetitive behaviors in this age group that weren't present before. Some parents said walking didn't really change much over this age range of 5 to 12. Sleep was a little bit worse, but we're used to it now, quote unquote. Was toilet trained by age 6, major achievement. And another parent told me that in this age group, and this child is now 9, the mom felt that this child really, really improved her interest in initiating social contact, had improvement in her gestural communication and more interest in communication, and was more interested in looking at picture books with me than she was when she was 3 or 4, and seemed to be more aware of other kids around her. And another reported, yes, my child's sleeping better in that age group just because we found the right medicine. So, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Thibert, who's in the cleanup position here to take you through the geriatric age group. So.
All right, great. So kind of like Mark and Jessica, I'm a pediatric trained person, but we've seen out of our 300 people, probably 80 to 100 are adults now, so just been seeing more and more adults as time goes on. Kids that I saw 11 years ago when the clinic started are now adults, so And we've been able to do, luckily, 2 studies on adults. So we have some data, both from a phone interview that we did years ago, and then also some of our clinic data. And so as I was saying, the first generation of kids that were diagnosed with Angelman back in the 80s and 90s are now adults. Even kids that were 4 or 5 when I started seeing them, they're now getting to be older teens. So there's just going to be a bigger and bigger population of adults with Angelman syndrome. And there's very little in the literature. We're getting more anecdotal evidence. But there's, in what's published, there's just not a big group of data, and that's where things like registries and the natural history study and all that can hopefully continue to add to that. One of the big issues is that, like as you see, we're all pediatric people, we're the ones seeing the adults. There's just not a lot of adult providers who are experienced in seeing not only people with Angelman syndrome, but just developmental disabilities in general. So the first study we did was a phone interview. Anna Larson, who was our research assistant at the time, she's now, it's a journal study, she's now a full pediatric neurologist. But she did back in 2009 or 10, published in 14, but it was 110 phone interviews, and we got some really great information. They lasted almost 2 hours. And then the second one we did was a little better because it was from clinic data, so it was people that we had actually seen and examined and looked at records from, and that was the first 50 plus that we had seen in our clinic. And interesting, from the first phone study, what we saw was that when we asked people the age of the most severe seizures, kind of as expected, it was in the early years, so a lot of it was kind of 0 to 10. And then there was a spike later in life. As I'll get to later, we think that most of these were probably not epileptic, but that kind of gave us a clue to what else was happening in adulthood. And these are some of the medicines, similar to what we saw in the survey we did back in 2006 to 2008. Depakote and clonazepam were the most commonly used. If you've heard me talk before, or if you hear me talk later, we see a lot of side effects from Depakote, a lot of motor side effects, a lot of regression. But at the time when adults were being put on medicine, kids in the 80s, early 90s, the 2 best medicines available were Depakote and Klonopin. Like, they were the absolutely best ones, so they were being put on the right medicines. It's just that there weren't a lot of options. Between the early 90s and 2000, several other medicines came out, and there's been another big spike from 2010 until now. So back in 1994, you had like 2 choices, and now there's over a dozen. So just the amount of seizure medicines, the options we have are just so much better than they were back in the older days. So seizures in adults, it's a busy slide, but the interesting part, and this is kind of what we have been seeing in clinic and what we kind of saw from the phone call, whereas over the lifespan, seizures are present in about 80 to 85% of people with Angelman syndrome. In adults, about 25% we're still having seizures. So kind of what we'll see with everything in adulthood, it's the same stuff that we saw in infancy, that we saw in childhood. It's just different. So there's twists on it. Some things get better, some things get worse. Seizures tend to, so like Mark was saying, a lot of us thought that, well, they just go away. And they don't quite go away, but at least 25% is better than 80%. And what we saw, at least in the first several folks, out of the ones that were still having seizures, about 2/3 were fairly infrequent and easy to control. So if you think about 1/3 of 1/4, it's probably a little less than 10% that still have tough to treat seizures in adulthood. It's not the 0 that we hoped it would be, but it's still less than 10%. So in general, they tend to get better, which is a good thing. So that's kind of the summary. They tend to get better. I won't stay too long on the slides. And then we have more stuff on the medications, I think. But looking at sleep, this was, I think, an important slide. There were still 72% that had sleep issues, which is either falling asleep or waking up early or in the middle of the night. But this was I thought was impressive, 7.4 hours sleep. Those of you with little kids, that's not something you see all the time. So just the amount of sleep, the reason why there's such a high percentage of people that still report sleep problems, even if the average is 7.4 hours, it's a broken sleep, it's waking up. But at least there's more sleep in a lot of people. And I think this is an important one. Compared to infancy, when we asked the questions of parents of adults, 77% said that sleep was better than when they were infants, and 68% said it was better than when they were adults. So it's not 100%, which would be nice, but somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of parents of adults said yes, it's better than when they were kids. And I think as time goes on, the adult issue, so the data that we have here, if we do this study again in 10 years, 15 years, it's going to be different because we have better seizure medicines, we have better sleep medicines, we have a better understanding of behavioral measures to help with sleep, a better understanding of, there's better therapies. So there's just more, and I think kids who are, say 2 or 3 now are going to be doing a lot better at 20 than kids who are 20 now, just because we have so much more at our disposal to help with, and just more knowledge. There were no Angelman clinics before in the U.S. before 2008, and then we started ours, and now there's 8, and there's going to be more. So it really changes a lot. So and if there's therapeutics that work, that's going to change things even more. But even if they don't work, there's still a ton of room for optimism for the future with the more information we have and the more medications that we have. And then this is just more of the same. Basically, the study that we did from our clinic patients showed about the same. That it's about 8 hours of sleep per night, but still, frequent wakings and trouble sleeping. So again, sleep isn't great for most people as an adult, but it's better for most people. So seizures tend to get better, sleep tends to get better. Again, not for everyone, but overall. So kind of the summary of the sleep compared to infancy and childhood, we saw 75%, 80% percent of parents thought it was improved from when they were kids, with average sleep times of 7.4 and 8 hours, which is a lot more than the little kids have in general. And anecdotally, there's not really a lot of data for sleep medicines, but we do the same thing we do for kids. We try behavioral techniques, we treat the anxiety, the constipation, anything medical, and then if needed, we have sleep medications. So GI issues, while sleep and seizures tend to get better for more people than not, GI issues don't seem to be worse. They're just there. The data we had for adults was the same as we did for the kids. We did a study on kind of all ages, and then plus the adult data, but it's about the same. 85% had constipation. That's pretty much the same as we saw in kids. About 50% had reflux, which is pretty much what we saw in kids. So it's just one of those things that it's just kind of there throughout the lifespan. Doesn't necessarily get better, doesn't necessarily get worse. It's just something that you have to work on. So if things are not so bad as a kid, they'll hopefully stay not so bad as an adult. If they're trickier as a kid, hopefully they'll still get better, but it's just one of those things you have to kind of keep watching. Because the GI tract, if you have low tone in your GI tract, it doesn't often improve the way that tone in your arms or legs might improve. So it's just something you have to kind of keep an eye on throughout. And then just the study we did through our clinic was pretty much the same thing, about 50% with reflux, 70% with constipation. So between the phone study and the clinic data, it was pretty similar. 3/4 or more with constipation, about half with reflux. And then, so orthopedics, so this is one area where I think things are going to change pretty significantly moving forward as far as adults. A lot of the adults that when they were kids, they were on phenobarbital, all these, Tegretol, which they shouldn't be on, even Depakote to some degree, that medicines that really kind of decrease bone density. And the physical therapies and the different things that are out there now weren't as good as they are now. So I think you're still going to be orthopedic issues, but I think there's going to be a lower rate of low bone density and other kinds of scoliosis, these kind of things. So and just having better seizure medicines, better everything, it's going to make a big difference. In the studies that we did, there were about 43% had some knee contractures, so basically like very tight hamstrings. 20 needed tendon lengthening surgery, 20% either if it was in the hamstring because the knee was tight, or at the ankle, the Achilles tendon because the ankle was tight. So even though we see low tone in kids, as they get older, more adults than not will get higher tone. It kind of shifts over time and they get tightness. So that's where keeping with the PT, having regular visits with an orthopedist or a physiatrist is really helpful. And with the right amount of therapies and the better treatments, I think we will over time see less and less of these kind of contractures and other difficulties. Scoliosis was common. About 50% had noticeable scoliosis. Out of those that had it, about 60% were mild to moderate, 39 were moderate to severe, 24% needed surgical intervention. I think that number will hopefully be coming down. But just one of those things over time where if you have low tone and you're not getting the right treatments, you're not as ambulatory as you want to be, that scoliosis is just going to get worse and worse over time. So, but I think it's, there's a lot more emphasis now on getting kids up and walking and staying up, and that really helps with avoiding this if possible. Bone density, so 16% noted osteoporosis. It was likely higher in the adults that we have, just those are the ones that had been tested for it. And then there's one of the studies that came out in 2007 noted a combination of limited mobility and chronic AED treatments. Individuals with Angelman have increased risk for fractures due to decreased bone density. And that's true. That was in 2007. This is 12 years later, so hopefully the medicines that are being used aren't the ones that lower bone density the way they did prior to that. Primary orthopedic issues are scoliosis, contractures, fractures. And in the phone study, 68% were walking independently. In the second study, we had about the same kind of results, a little bit less scoliosis that we're seeing, but same thing, 20% with low bone density, and about 65 walking independently. And like I said, I'm hopeful that these numbers will get higher and higher over time. Challenging behaviors. So back then we didn't understand the behavior and anxiety part as well as we do now. This was back in 2009, 2010, so we didn't ask as many questions. But from what we asked, there about 3/4 saw aggressive behavior towards others, 52% self-injuries, 48 either obsessive or persistent, and then emotional trigger identified, 20% said anxiety, and there was probably a lot more. Those are the ones that were identified as anxiety, and then definitely frustration was a big thing. In the study we did for the clinic data, and again, that was before we had a bigger psychiatry kind of focus. Symptoms, 55% with symptoms of anxiety, 24% impulsive or aggressive, 12% defiant. I think we're going to see different numbers of that. Dr. Carey is going to be talking about that later and do a whole talk on the anxiety and behavior piece, which is going to be great. And then medicines that had been used. So Onfi, we don't prescribe it for anxiety, but like Mark was saying, the question comes up, when do you come off of seizure medicines? And so a lot of times we'll have people that are seizure free. So, what we're seeing, about 2/3 of people probably don't need to be on seizure medicines. But if they're on Onfi, seizure medicine, we usually leave it on because it helps with anxiety. We've had people that we've taken it off. Seizures haven't come back, they've gotten really anxious, we put it back. So if they're on a medicine that treats seizures that will also treat anxiety or mood, we often just leave it on. And even outside of the Angelman population, we've had people on Onfi, Topamax, other medications that we came off, no seizures, but behavior really got difficult, so went back up. So it kind of shifts from a seizure medicine to an anxiety medicine in some ways. But, and that's kind of a way to kind of get around that difficult decision of when do you come off medicine. If it's helping something else, you just stay on it, and then you have seizure protection as well, which is a kind of a 2-for-1. We like the 2-for-1s. And then so just kind of an overall adult summary. 80 to 90% of children have seizures, but these improve towards puberty and less frequent in adults. Again, about 80+% have seizures over the lifetime. In the adults, we're seeing about 1/4. So it definitely gets better, but in some, like Mark was saying, it doesn't just go away for everybody. In some people, it kind of persists. But luckily, it's not as difficult to treat in more than not of those adults that have it. Sleep tends to get better. Again, about 75% of people said it was better than infancy, better than childhood, but it's still an issue. The 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep per night is actually really good for the adults that we've seen. Some of them have less sleep, but the ones that are sleeping more and still reporting problems, it's the waking. They'll sleep, 4 hours, be up for an hour, 2 hours, up for an hour, 2 hours. It's that consolidating sleep that can become difficult, but we're working on ways to kind of get that better. And GI kind of stays. Constipation, reflux are always going to be issues, but again, we don't really see any clear worsening or improving. It's just kind of always something to keep an eye on. Orthopedics, again, about 2/3 walk independently, and we're hopeful that number just keeps rising every year with the better treatments that we have. And then I don't have, for some reason, I don't have this. I had them on the talk earlier. I must have deleted them by mistake. But going back to the seizure data where we had that 20% of seizures, what we found was that we were getting, when we did that first study, A lot of parents were saying, they had drop seizures, staring spells, all this kind of stuff. They got better, they went away, and then at 12, 14, 15, developed a new seizure type where they just twitch for several seconds, several minutes. And we were hearing that a lot, and then we started seeing that in clinic. And most of them were fairly mild. It was just kind of twitching in the hands, but some were much more severe. The twitching went from hands to arms to whole body. In extreme cases, it can go for hours. And so the first couple of kids that we saw, adult kids with the really severe myoclonus, we brought them in for EEG monitoring, and kind of what we thought based on what they looked like, the EEG was normal while all that twitching was happening. And if you really watch the episodes, when they have them, they're awake, they're alert, they can follow commands, they try to eat, but they twitch so much they really can't do what they want to do. And because it's not a seizure, it's not dangerous to the brain, it's not hurting the brain, it's not causing problems, but it's just a huge quality of life issue. It's got to be scary. It looks like it's probably painful. Kids seem tired afterwards. It's like they've been at the gym for a couple hours. So if it's just little mild twitches, we don't worry about it. If it's really affecting quality of life, we try to treat it aggressively. In the most severe case, we actually brought someone into the ICU and just really bombed him with medicine. He's doing great now, but it's, it becomes such a quality of life issue, it becomes really important to treat. So we've been working on that. I'll talk about it more in the seizure talk, but the best ways to prevent non-epileptic myoclonus or not prevent, but to minimize it as much as possible, are to prevent the triggers. What we see is that, it can kind of be there on and off throughout the day mildly, but poor sleep will make it a bunch worse. Severe constipation, people that poop once a week, it gets much worse. And we even see it where it kind of gets worse and worse and worse and worse, and they poop and it's better, and then it gets worse and worse and worse and they poop. Anxiety, so a lot of times we'll see it really kick up with a new caregiver, a change in location, new staff. So anything that can kind of is a life change will trigger it. And so we really kind of focus on those triggers, try to minimize them as much as possible. And then if it's still an issue, then that's when we use medicines. And the best medicines for them are the benzos. Basically, the medicines that treat myoclonic seizures will treat the non-epileptic myoclonus. So clobazam, Klonopin, Valium. And then we usually combine that with Keppra or Briviact. So Keppra is a really good anti-myoclonus medicine. If that doesn't work, or if it makes people too cranky, then there's a newer medicine, so that's levetiracetam. Brivaracetam is like the next generation. Keppra came out a couple of years ago, and we've had some really good luck with that. People that either didn't respond to Keppra or were just too cranky on it have had good luck on the brivaracetam. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that CBD has been helpful. It's not indicated by the FDA for kind of this basically movement disorder myoclonus, so it's hard to get through insurance, but for the FDA approved version. But a lot of families that have tried hemp oil or other forms of CBD have had really good luck. Not across the board, but kind of like any seizure medicine, helps some people, doesn't help others. But I think that's a promising treatment for that. We just don't have any clear data on it, just kind of anecdotal evidence from families trying it. But kind of to add that into the summary, we typically see seizures get better, sleep get better. Not for everybody, but overall, they tend to be easier issues. GI is fairly similar throughout. We see anxiety increase a lot, and we see the non-epileptic myoclonus, and that's probably, they kind of go hand in hand. I think with more anxiety, you get more myoclonus. So, and what's really interesting is when the kids are younger, the person at our clinic that deals with them the most is me. It's mostly seizures and it's sleep stuff. When they become adults, Dr. Curie is the one that actually handles them the most, because anxiety becomes kind of the overriding issue. And with the anxiety and the other kind of behavioral stuff, you see worse sleep, more myoclonus, and it becomes tricky. But for a lot of times when we see bad myoclonus, the medicines help, but it's either the psychiatrist or the gastroenterologist that really makes the biggest difference controlling it, because they're really triggered by other things going on. So so just kind of overall, and that's our clinic. Overall, a lot of things get better, but because nature can't be fair. Seizures get better, sleep gets better, but with that, we see more anxiety and more myoclonus. But we're getting better at identifying it and trying to treat it, and so that's kind of from a clinical standpoint, I know there's research and there's therapeutics going on, but just from a pure clinical standpoint, that's kind of where we're headed. The issues are the same, they just kind of change over time. Some things get easier, some things get harder, and we're just trying to kind of keep track of them. So I think that's it, and I think we have a few minutes for questions, if anybody wants to do that. Thanks.
Hello? Oh, yeah. I had a question about the non-epileptic myoclonus, and you saw my daughter a couple of years ago, and another mom from California whose son was a patient of yours, Dr. Nespeca, is that how you say it? And I've been texting her and through this whole thing. And I guess what we wanted to know, would there be more research into non-epileptic myoclonus? I mean, if you haven't seen it, when we came to see you, she was having them, hours on end, and her neuro thought they were seizures. She was way over medicated. I don't even think she was able to sit up in your appointment. But you got her down to 2 meds, and so she has a quality of life. And I was telling people it's not seizures, but it's honestly equally debilitating if you are having 3 or 4 90-minute where you're like, your whole body is literally shaking. So, we did get our quality of life back, but we're wondering, because it's, we got to keep her, regular, we got to treat the GERD, all this stuff. Is anybody planning to do a lot more in-depth research onto that? And then I wanted to mention that Stacy Vetterly, they were just diagnosed because nothing was helping her, the Briviact and the Onfi, none of that was helping. And so her son was diagnosed with dystonia and is being treated with another completely different drug that I don't remember what it is, but there's one other person in the Facebook group on Shaking Angels that's being treated with that drug too, which was kind of new. I didn't know if I should bring it up here or in the seizure one, but since it's not seizures, I thought I would. No,
this is a perfect place. And we hear that from a lot of people. They say, these aren't seizures, but they're worse. Like they think, and it's, we had one poor woman that had one for 24 hours, then she had to end up in the hospital. So even though it's not seizure, it's not hurting the brain, it looks fine on the EEG, it's debilitating, like you said. You can't eat, you can't do what you need to do just throughout the day. That's come up a couple times with the dystonia. It's not like a known or clear Angelman symptom, but as we see more adults, there's just like 1 or 2, 3 that pop up that tend to have more than just the tremor and the myoclonus, and that's something that we've been kind of keeping a closer eye on. We just recently had somebody that we sent to the movement disorder specialist, but typically it's the ataxia, it's the tremor, it's the myoclonus, but we've just recently in the last year seen 1 or 2 people that seem to have a little bit more of a dystonic component. And then one of the things you always ask too is if they're having any kind of dystonias or any strange things, is it part of the syndrome or is it a medicine? Because some of the behavioral medicines can cause that. So you always think, okay, is it a side effect? Is it part of the? So that's what we don't know, if it's part of the syndrome, or if it's a medicine side effect, or if it's just kind of unrelated. But it's not common. But we've seen a couple people that seemed a bit dystonic that are on the levodopa that had the trial on. Have you seen any dystonia?
So the only one that I recognized as having dystonia was sort of post a physiatrist at our institution suspecting that the child had dystonia, and it really was preventing him from walking. And he wasn't that old, he was like 12 or 13. And the physiatrists, rehab medicine doctors, physiatrists, tend to have, in my view, a more limited repertoire of what they use. It's Artane, baclofen, Botox injections, phenol injections, and things like that. So they saw this boy and said, he's probably got dystonia, let's put him on baclofen. And bingo, he was walking around again.
Wow.
And normally, my experience with developmentally disabled kids is that baclofen may reduce spasticity and make it easier for them to be cared for because they're less spastic. but I haven't really seen it help people walk much. It can be a very sedating medication, but in this boy, it was very helpful for at least a year.
It's
Then
been
the
helpful for
effect-
Zach.
Pardon me?
For Stacy Vetterly's son, who was a
Oh, I
patient of
know,
yours.
yeah.
He's been on it only a short time, but it's been helpful.
Was it baclofen?
I can't remember. It's on my phone. I'll go look.
I bet it's tetrabenazine.
It's a longer.
That's the new
That's
one.
it. That's it.
That's the newer one.
But I also
And that one was previously one that you could not, it was an extraordinarily expensive medication that you could not get authorization for unless your patient had Huntington's chorea
Wow.
years ago. But now I think it's generic now. And I think insurance companies are more liberal with who they'll approve it for.
I wanted to mention, I meant to mention this before, one other thing. Emily will be 30 in October, and about a year and a half ago, she started having the most violent tonic-clonics that were triggered by the NEMs. I mean, thank God they only last
Triggered by what? I'm sorry.
the non-epileptic myoclonics.
Oh, yeah.
Were as bad as they were when she was 2 or 3. I'm talking not breathing, violent convulsions, that thank God only last about 30 seconds because her lips are blue. You know, and I guess this might be another question for the seizure session, but should we keep, first of all, do you know of any other adults that happens with the really bad tonic-clonics come back that she hadn't had in, God, 18 years or longer? And should we have oxygen on hand? I mean, if it goes much longer, I know she wouldn't survive. So I don't know. Those were just all my questions.
No, we have seen a couple of, so it's not, kind of like seizures in general in adults aren't as common. That's not as common, but we have seen it for sure. We've seen, because with seizures, usually something triggers it, an illness, bad sleep, but in some cases, the myoclonus is so severe, and I think it probably causes a ton of anxiety, and then we've seen it trigger seizures. What's interesting was there was even one person that we monitored, and they were having this long myoclonic episode, and the twitching, the EEG was fine, and then they had an absence seizure during it. So, like, further proof that it wasn't epileptic, they actually had a seizure on EEG during the event, and watch the twitching was there, and then they stopped and stared while they were continuing to twitch, and then it stopped, and so it was like a true absence during the myoclonus. But yeah, no, it's a stressor to the body, so it can be a seizure trigger. A lot of the medicines that we use to help it are seizure meds, so sometimes just adjusting those can help that. As far as the oxygen, that's one area where it's tricky for us pediatric providers. In children, we really don't use oxygen because they're so healthy and their bodies are so so good at adapting to things. They really don't get hypoxic when they seize. You can see the blueness, but it's just because the brain's smart and it sends oxygen to the brain and the lungs, the brain and the heart, and away from the skin. But in some adults, especially if there's a lot of scoliosis, there may be some pulmonary issues that we just don't see as pediatricians. And so when there's concerns about that, we usually just have people see a pulmonologist just to make sure that lung function's okay, and then we let them kind of decide if oxygen's necessary. So that's always an option for people if there's a worry about breathing, and if oxygen's needed, we send to the pulmonologist, because it's there shouldn't, in children we don't see that unless there's other medical stuff going on. But as people get older, especially if there's scoliosis and other things, you might not have the same lung function you had as a kid, and so that's when we get the pulmonologist involved to really do a good assessment and do some testing and see if it's needed. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, doctors. I have kind of a couple of questions. One is about the natural history study. My son was in the study, but we stopped because of some family issues. So my question, we go to Dr. Nespeca's clinic. We stopped for 4 years or so. Is there an option for us at this time to do telemedicine so we don't have to drive to San Diego since we've already started it? I know you talked about telemedicine, but does that apply for natural history study? And then my next question is I have two orthopedic questions. My son is 14, and he started bending his knees, like he started walking like this. So what are your recommendations for that? Does my son need physical therapy at this time when he's 14? Insurance doesn't cover for it anymore. What are the ways that we can go about it? And then tight tendons. He wore braces for a long time up until just a couple of months ago. We stopped using it. Our physical therapy switched it over to just the arch that we bought from Walmart. But all these years he was wearing the almost like knee-level AFOs. So how do we go about tight tendons, the bent knees, and then natural history question? Thank you.
Now, can you hear me? Okay. So I have not talked with Dr. Bird about doing telemedicine natural history study visits. And is Wen Han in the room? I think there he is. Is your microphone working? I'll let you address that.
So just on the point of natural history study, if you care to stay for a few minutes after this session, I'm actually giving a talk on the natural history study, and we'll tell you a little bit more about options for remote participation. So hold that thought, or come back to it. I will let the others answer the medical questions first.
So one aspect of the natural history study is a neurological exam that is a challenge to do through the televised situations without feeling muscle tone and so forth. So, but that might end up having a modification of the natural history study to enroll more individuals. And I think in Megan Cross's global registry, there's probably, I don't know if there's direct examination evidence of that. So, but I think a lot of the data in the natural history study has the potential of being captured through a telemedicine visit.
So question number 2. So the answer to PT is an easy one. It's yes. I think people need PT for life. It's tough because some states are just really anti-giving people anything. And then one of the things that drives me crazy that we see is, well, they're doing much better, so we're going to stop therapy, but it's because of the therapy that they're doing well. So ideally you want therapy forever, if you can have it, even adulthood, just the more the better. The whole thing with mobility is just being up, being ambulatory, not getting stiff, and that's what we see if there's not, the right therapies and, people at school, at home, getting people up and around. Over time, the muscles get tight, the tendons kind of shrink down, and then that's when you get trouble walking, and you get contractures and other things, scoliosis. As far as the knee bending, it's interesting. I don't know if anyone else has seen it, but one reason to bend at the knees is if your hamstrings get tight. So if the muscles in the back of your legs tighten up, you end up you can't straighten your legs all the way, so you kind of bend over, and then kids have to kind of lean forward to keep from falling. But I've seen a few teens and young adults recently that I can't really explain. They walk like that. They walk knees bent, hunched over, but when you examine them, they don't have any tightness. It's like a sensory thing, kind of like little kids walk on their toes just because it's a sensory thing, and they don't have tight ankles, but they toe walk. We've seen these teens and adults that kind of crouch down. I don't know if it's like a balance thing or a sensory thing, but what we do is when we see them, I try to do a good exam and try to see if their hamstrings are tight, and if they are, we make sure they get into the physiatrist or orthopedist. But if their legs aren't tight, it's continued PT, but there's something sensory, and it's like kids with toe walking. It's one of those things they do. I don't know, have you seen that?
Yeah, so we see this a lot, actually, and we think it starts around age 11, where kids start to develop what we're calling a crouch gait. So they're walking with their legs kind of in, like you're describing, and hunched over a little bit. And what we found is helpful is sometimes, especially if they've gotten out of physical therapy, doing some intensive physical therapy, like every day for a few weeks. We can prescribe that, but it sometimes is difficult to get insurance to cover it. But doing some intensive physical therapy and then getting back into regular physical therapy, sometimes going back in the braces, because it can be, just like it can be increased muscle tone, it can also be low muscle tone and them compensating for low muscle tone, so getting back in some supportive braces can be helpful. And then the other thing that we found is really helpful is aquatic physical therapy, probably also because it's very motivating to be in the pool for them, and at that age when the crouch gait starts to develop, behavior can be a big issue, so doing ABA therapy can also really help, because sometimes it can be somewhat behavioral.
So one thing I think can be helpful just as a proactive thing to do for your child is to, children who are walking, once a year, take a 2-minute video of them walking up and down the driveway or the sidewalk, so that if in the future there's a deterioration in their walking and some health plan is arguing with you, saying this is a figment of your imagination, or a physical therapist is doubting the truth of what you say, you can show it to them and say, hey, we want to get back to where we were, and can you help us do that? We want to try a period of intensive physical therapy, which often works not just in kids with Angelman syndrome, but with other kids with motor disabilities. So. Just a little switch on the...
Thank you. Quick curiosity question. What's the oldest Angelman syndrome individual that you've dealt with in age?
The oldest I've seen is 47, I think. That's a great question. I forgot to bring that up. So we don't have, the question is, do they only live to be 47? I think there's probably a lot of 50, 60, maybe 70-year-olds out there that just were never diagnosed. This is it's a syndrome that was first described in 65, and the gene was discovered in the 90s. So, when people get to be 30, 40, their parents typically don't go back and get testing. So I think there probably are older individuals, retirement age individuals out there with Angelman syndrome. We just don't know it. At least anecdotally, one of the adults, I see a couple in their mid-40s who walk independently, who travel with their parents all over the country, and they're just doing fantastic. They're doing as well as any of the 20-year-olds we see. It's a small sample size, but at least from the ones that we've seen, we've probably seen maybe a half a dozen now, 40-ish or more, and they don't really seem any different in a good way as compared to those in their 30s or late 20s. We, so far, and we don't know what time will tell when they get to be 50 and older, but at least so far in the small sample of 40-year-olds, we have not seen any decline, which is great. So that's, I wish it were hundreds of people, but, in the few that we've seen, we haven't seen any big drop-off from the 30s, which I think is really promising. And I think we'll know more as the 30 and 40-year-olds that we see now. In 10, 20 years, we'll know a lot more about how they do. But, the oldest people, there was a case report about a 70-year-old a while back, but as of now, the oldest people that I think a lot of us know about are late 40s, 50-ish, but I think there are older ones out there we just don't know the diagnosis. There's one guy I see in his 40s who has a girlfriend at his daycare, and he carries her picture around, and she's, I think, close to 50, and if you look at the picture, she has Angelman syndrome, she clearly does, and, they say, well, she doesn't have a diagnosis, but she has it, so, I mean, there's people like her, that are 50, 60 maybe, that probably have the diagnosis, and they just haven't been diagnosed.
Okay. Hey, guys, thank you, and thank you for the question.